panel addresses more subtle mechanisms for managing diversity in European integration, flexible implementation, and experimentalist governance. And the overarching question of this panel is, are flexible implementation and experimentalist governance viable alternatives to differentiated integration to manage diversity in the European Union? And I might add a subtitle next to being viable alternatives. The question would be also, are these mechanisms perhaps even part of differentiated integration or a complement to differentiated integration? To address these questions, we have the great pleasure to bring together perspectives from research, from an EU member state, and from the European Commission. Two speakers from the INDIV EU consortium funded under the Horizon 2020 program are Sebastiaan Princen and Jonathan Seitlin. Sebastiaan Princen is an associate professor in the field of European governance at Utrecht University School of Governance. And within the EU INDIV project, he has coordinated work on flexible implementation across secondary legislation. And he will summarize the main findings from this research. And our second speaker, Jonathan Seitlin, has led the research on experimentalist governance in the INDIV EU project. Jonathan is Professor of Public Policy and Governance and Distinguished Faculty Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And he's also among the founders of, or the founding academic director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES. Now it is fantastic that we have the opportunity to discuss the main findings of this fascinating research on the functioning of flexibility mechanisms with two personalities who are confronted with their manifestation on the ground in EU policy making and implementation. We welcome as representative from an EU member state, Ambassador Irena Andrassy. Mrs. Andrassy is permanent representative of the Republic of Croatia to the European Union. And Ambassador Andrassy is also very well placed to reflect on the question of managing diversity in the EU from the perspective of the Commission, because she has also served two mandates as deputy head of cabinet in the European Commission in consumer policy, which is one of the fields that is also covered in the studies by Sebastiaan Princen, and in international cooperation on development. I should also add that Ambassador Andrassy knows the question of managing diversity in the EU from having contributed to the process of Croatia's accession to the European Union as a legal advisor of the chief negotiator and negotiator responsible for legal issues and the accession treaty preparations. Last but not least, our fourth speaker is Carsten Schierenbeck. He's a member of the cabinet of European Commission Vice President Maros Šefčovič, responsible for the portfolio of better regulation and simplification, as well as for supporting interinstitutional relations. And Dr. Schierenbeck also knows the EU from the side of a member state, as he was seconded in 2020 to the German EU presidency to help negotiating in the field of industry, internal market, and the single market program. Now, Carsten's bio for this conference includes a very interesting sentence that I will quote. It puts, he is a fan of agile and participatory leadership, active stakeholder engagement, and building bridges between industrial innovation, SME, and regional policy. Now, this sounds fascinating, and I'm curious to hear how it relates, this focus on the role of private actors, how this focus relates to the mechanisms of flexible implementation and experimentalist governance that we will discuss on this panel. But I should say also more broadly to how we look at differentiated integration and how it might evolve in the future. So to say it again, the focus on the private actors, on the role of industry and industry associations, I think it's an issue that is not yet very well researched, that speaks, however, very well to experimentalist governance and flexible implementation, as we will hear. So this should give enough food for thought for a fruitful conversation. So in the first step, we will start with short presentations of the research done in the EU project by Sebastiaan Princen and Jonathan Seitlin. They will explain to you what are flexible implementation and experimentalist governance and how they see them as alternatives or rather complements or even parts of differentiated integration. So the floor is yours. Perhaps Sebastian, you want to start?
Yes, thank you, Sandra. I will not summarize the research that we did in our work package, but I will try to give a brief overview of what is flexible implementation and also how it relates to differentiated integration. And then we can get to details later on if that's useful in the conversation. So let me start with what is flexible implementation. Well, basically it means that member states are given the room to make further choices during the implementation of EU law and policies. And this can take various forms. Probably the best or one of the best known forms is minimum harmonization. So member states has the opportunity to adopt more stringent standards than the EU regulatory framework prescribes. But there are many others. For instance, sometimes member states can adjust the scope of an EU arrangement. They can either include cases that are not by default under the EU level arrangement, or they can exclude cases. And so then there's a level of scope discretion. Yet another form is when member states are given the choice between regulatory options. They can be given a choice between two discrete options, or there can be a default option, and then member states can also adopt an alternative if they can show that it achieves the same purpose. And of course, in many cases, EU member states have to specify EU level provisions, and they are also specifically asked to do so in a directive or regulation. So these are just some examples of forms of flexible implementation that we studied in our work package. And of course, if you have this type of flexibility in EU level arrangements, you will get differences in implementation between member states. It will not be the same in every member state, which leads to forms of differentiation, and which is also the link with the broader topic of this conference and of the entire project. Now, flexible implementation has always been part and parcel of EU law. It's always been there. It's been institutionalized, most clearly in the instrument of directives, which need to be transposed, which are meant to give member states the opportunity to align EU level policies and law with their domestic context. But still, there isn't a lot of explicit attention to flexibility as a way to accommodate heterogeneity in the EU. Insofar as there has been attention to implementation by member states, most of it is focused on compliance, and the question has been how to improve compliance, or from an academic point of view, how to explain differences in compliance records. And on the part of the EU institutions, there has always been a drive towards both reducing non-compliance, but also increasing uniformity in enforcement and application of EU law. And this has been also a theme in a number of recent communications by the Commission. So the focus has been on uniformity based on the idea that diversity also has a number of disadvantages, which obviously it may have. At the same time, it may also offer a number of advantages in the sense that flexibility may allow member states to tailor EU level law and policies to domestic context. And in that way, it may also contribute to more effective policymaking and more legitimate policymaking. And the question that we sought to answer in this part of the project was to what extent, under what conditions, flexible implementation may actually perform that role and may actually be a viable way to deal with heterogeneity. Now, a bit on the relationship with a differentiated integration. To begin with, flexible implementation and differentiated integration address similar concerns. They're both concerned with heterogeneity among member states. And this can play a role in the decision-making stage. When member states cannot agree in the Council, both offering opt-outs and offering flexibility may be a way to move ahead. but also from a more, one could say, substantive or inherent perspective, both try to acknowledge the fact that member states have different backgrounds, different conditions, different preferences, and that EU law somehow needs to take that into account. So the underlying concerns are similar in a way, and this is also brought out by the analysis that we did based on a data set of flexibility provisions in directives that we compiled, which we linked with an existing data set on opt-outs and derogations in EU law, so differentiated integration. And what we found is that there is indeed an association between the two. So if a directive has more flexibility provisions, it also tends to have more opt-outs and vice versa. At the same time, the specific use of the two is not the same. So we see when you look at more specific cases, one can see that differentiated integration is mainly used to address specific concerns by individual member states, whereas flexible implementation is a way to deal with more broader concerns among a range or maybe even all member states. And so that is a difference in the way they're used. So they go together in a way. There is some similarity, but there's also a difference in the way they're being used. Having said that, they're not alternatives. Or actually, this already shows that they're not alternatives in the sense that they can go together. And you can see this in many cases. For instance, EMU is a prime example of differentiated integration, where not all member states are involved in the Eurozone, but at the same time, within the Eurozone, there's also quite some flexibility when it comes to the way member states need to deal with a number of requirements, for instance, regarding the budget. So they can go together, and that is an interesting fact because it means that you can also look at different combinations between the two, which allows you to strike very different balances between EU-level cooperation and member state autonomy. In a general sense, what sets flexible implementation apart from differentiated integration is that under flexible implementation, flexibility applies to all member states. So all member states are part of the same EU-level arrangement, but within that, they have room to make their own choices. Whereas under DI, it's all or nothing. You're in or you're out, at least on paper. But you can also combine the two, and in that way, you can address different types of concerns, and you can also look at different ways to balance, on the one hand, the need or desire to work together at the European level, but on the other hand, also the desire to retain a level of autonomy on the part of member states. And I think that's why a flexible implementation is an interesting alternative or other way of differentiating within the EU, which also deserves more specific attention and also more specific consideration in terms of as one of the ways in which we could deal with the diversity that exists among EU member states. And I would like to leave it at this for the moment.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I think we will have the opportunity to talk more about the conditions under which this flexibility has been granted in legislation, and maybe also a little bit about the evolution over time, whether this is something that has become more common across policy areas, or maybe that there is an evolution within secondary legislation where flexibility becomes more constrained over time when policies are being reformed. I think these would be interesting insights also regarding the long-term contribution of a flexible implementation in combination with differentiated integration, which might be also more long-standing way of managing diversity. And there are also multiple connections to the notion of experimentalist governance that Jonathan Seitlin has been studying. So I think we can just hand over to Jonathan before we talk a bit more about detailed findings of your research.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sandra. What I'm going to do is first to tell you a bit about what experimentalist governance is, and I want to say something about what we could call the scope conditions for it and the benefits when those scope conditions are realized. And finally, I want to say something about the relationship to differentiated integration in terms of alternative and complementarity. And I want to save discussion of empirical findings of the research done in our work package for the second intervention. So let me say that experimentalist governance is a recursive process of provisional goal setting and revision based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience in different local contexts. In its classic form, experimentalism involves a multi-level governance architecture whose 4 functional elements are linked in an iterative cycle. In this governance architecture, framework goals, rules, and metrics for assessing their achievement are established jointly by some combination of what we can call central and local actors. In this case, in the EU institutions and the member states, and typically also involves consultation with relevant stakeholders, including private actors. And then the local or lower level units like national administrations and regulatory authorities are given substantial discretion to pursue these goals in ways adapted to their local context. But in return for this autonomy, they must report regularly on their performance and participate in a peer review in which their results are compared to those of others, following different means towards the same ends. Where lower level units are not making good progress, they're expected to take corrective measures based on a plausible plan for improvement informed by the experience of their peers. The goals, rules, metrics, and decision-making procedures are then periodically revised in response to the problems and possibilities revealed by the review process, and then this cycle repeats. Often, it should be emphasized, these architectures are underpinned by what we call penalty defaults. These are mechanisms that induce reluctant parties to cooperate in framework rulemaking and respect its outcomes while stimulating them to propose plausible and superior alternatives. And they do this typically by threatening to reduce the actors' control over their own fate. In the EU, such penalty defaults frequently involve court judgments or commission decisions or threats of such decisions, and these oblige member states and also sometimes private actors to explore how to pursue their preferred goals in ways compatible with European law, but without hierarchically imposing specific solutions. Now to say something about the scope conditions. So experimentalist governance in this form depends on several scope conditions. The first is strategic uncertainty. This means that policymakers, policy actors can't define their precise goals or how best to achieve them in advance, but they must instead discover both in the course of problem solving. And this because they're operating in a turbulent, rapidly changing environment. A second scope condition is a polyarchic or multipolar distribution of power in which no single dominant actor is able to impose their own preferred solution without taking into account the views of others. A third scope condition is a high level of diversity, which increases the difficulty of adopting and enforcing uniform rules. And a final condition concerns interdependence. This must be sufficient to motivate actors to collaborate in seeking joint solutions to common problems, but it must not be so high as to preclude decentralized experimentation by local units. Now, where these scope conditions are met, experimentalist governance architectures arguably have four fundamental advantages, and this relative both to conventional uniform regulation and to differentiated integration. First, they accommodate diversity by adapting common goals and rules to varied local contexts, rather than seeking to impose one-size-fits-all solutions or dividing member states into separate groups of ins and outs. Secondly, experimentalist governance provides a mechanism for coordinated learning from local experimentation through disciplined comparison of different approaches to advancing the same general goals. And this learning mechanism can then be used dynamically to generate new policy solutions and regulatory frameworks which may be applied in contextually specific ways across the Union as a whole. A third benefit is the same processes of mutual monitoring, peer review, and joint evaluation that support learning from diverse experience also provide dynamic, non-hierarchical mechanisms for holding both central and lower level actors accountable for their actions in pursuit of agreed goals. And finally, because both the goals themselves and the means for achieving them are explicitly conceived as provisional and subject to revision in light of experience, problems identified in one phase of implementation can be corrected in the next iteration. Let me conclude now by talking about the relationship of experimentalist governance to differentiated integration. Is it a complement or an alternative, or maybe both? So the first thing we can say is that enduring, non-temporary differentiated integration is a pretty blunt instrument in which the key policy choice must be reducible to a binary option that member states can choose to embrace or reject. DI in this form can help to unblock impasses in European integration by allowing member states who wish to move ahead in a given policy area to do so in the face of opposition from others. And that is something I think we have heard in other panels in this conference. But differentiated integration in itself does nothing to address the very substantial challenges of accommodating diversity among participating countries. And for this, experimentalist governance, or indeed other forms of flexible integration and implementation, are instead crucial. And so a conclusion that I'll come back to later on is that this suggests that experimentalist governance and differentiated integration may well be complementary, but asymmetrically so, in the sense that differentiated integration depends on experimentalism to accommodate diversity within and across separate groups of member states, but not vice versa. You can have experimentalist governance without differentiated integration. And so I will stop here, and I'll give you some empirical findings in my next intervention.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. This is an intriguing statement that differentiated integration depends on experimentalism, but experimentalism can function without differentiated integration. And this establishes the link to differentiated integration very well. So I understand your analysis of the relationship between experimentalism and differentiated integration as a way to say that it's a more subtle way to manage diversity. But at the same time, if integration goes into the direction of differentiation, then it has to go along also with these mechanisms of experimentalism. We did not touch too much on empirical examples in this first introduction, but perhaps this is actually good, because then our experts from the member states and from the European Commission can have a first reaction regardless of concrete manifestations of these subtle modes of governance. So I would like to hand over immediately to Ambassador Andrassy and then Mr. Schierenbeck to tell us where you see the most viable ways to deal with diversity in the European Union, where you see the role of these flexibility mechanisms in implementation, but also in experimenting during the policy making and implementation process, and the connection to differentiated integration. So perhaps Ambassador Andrassy, would you like to go next?
Yes, I can. And hello to everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I'm just checking. Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation for this quite impressive discussion. I was trying to listen a little bit on the previous panels today so that I can be better informed and not repeat things. But I will start with maybe 3 comments. One, a general one from the perspective of a member state and a new member state. So I will reflect a little bit on differentiation that happens in the process of accession. And then the third one is from the perspective of working in the council. So from the general perspective, I would say that all the understandings of differentiated integration are useful when we discuss the fact. And the fact is 27 member states, very different ones, for different reasons, different geographies, different histories, different mentalities, different economic standard. And my first remark is that the EU as a project should aim, in my opinion, to more convergence, not less. So getting closer rather than bringing ourselves apart with too many differentiations in implementation of the EU acquis. My point is that I believe that the EU can be more effective if there is more convergence. Divisions are sometimes more visible, especially in the public sphere, but mostly we do arrive at a decision at EU level with institutional cooperation, intersectorial cooperation, with negotiations among the institutions, but more often than not, we do arrive at the decision. And together, then we are more effective as European Union. The second comment is about differentiation that happens actually already in the pre-accession phase. When you negotiate membership, especially in the latest rounds, I believe, we were the only ones, I mean, we were alone, but also the groups before us, you begin to understand the differentiation and how different you are and how far apart or not you are from the standards that you have to apply as a member. So when negotiation happens, actually it's not about negotiating, it's about reaching the standards and maybe perhaps ask for more time to implement when you are a member certain parts of the acquis. But also the fact is that in the latest negotiations, opt-outs or choosing not to be part of certain area of the EU cooperation was not an option, more or less not an option. Where differentiation happens was there where more preparation or some conditions are necessary, like Euro or Schengen, that you are obliged to implement at a certain moment, but you are differentiated by the fact that actually from the date of accession, even if you want to, you are not in the same group or you do not apply the whole acquis. But also the differentiation happens from the other side. The EU can request as well some transitional periods, like for us, it was the most commonly known and visible in public was the free movement. There was a measure that was applied for 7 years where there were restrictions in free movement of the citizens from a new member state to another. So I would say this was also kind of an element that made us different from the other side of the coin, and not because we couldn't apply or participate in the free movement, or the figures were not showing that, you know, there was an overflow of workers, for instance, in our case, but still you were differentiated. That said, as you enter into the EU, you try, and at least for my country, we tried always to become the part of the inner circle. I saw in some of the research that Croatia was noted as where citizens see the multi-speed Europe favorably. I'm not sure where this is coming from, but I can only comment that because of that notion where you feel as a member state that you are not perhaps a part of the inner circle or inner club, we want to become a fully integrated member state. Hopefully next year or in 23, for both of the cases that I just mentioned, we make all the effort. And in the public sphere, there are issues of sharing sovereignty or giving up, or but there is also the kind of a feeling that is that the citizens want the same opportunities as any other citizens. So I would say that the discussions on sovereignty in theoretical terms, whatever, these days, what sharing of sovereignty is completely different, perhaps, notion that it used to be, at least for a smaller member state. I think that this perception of having all the opportunities is winning. So I would say in commenting how we work in the Council, especially from the perspective of a smaller member state, there are mechanisms that always are useful when we try to make decisions. I would say that smaller member states always are more inclined to be collaborative than bigger ones because of the especially when there's QMB. But I mean, we try to arrive also a lot to a consensus, which means that we really do look and try to reach it to arrive to more convergence. So the first inclination is always that. Of course, there are issues where we cannot arrive at the consensus, but I think I would always claim that it's better, even if it's a decision where there is maybe a lower common denominator, that decision is better than a blockade or a block decision. But okay, that depends on a case by case. But what colleagues have mentioned and the previous speakers have noticed in the research is very interesting on the peer pressure element. So I would say that if we are commenting on flexibility and how the decisions are made specifically in the Council, I would say that kind of peer pressure works. And maybe it's a more flexible mechanism, but I think it's a preferable one than to the fines, the infringements, the court cases, and any other elements that are more stringent than arriving at a solution that can be something that everybody can live with. So that said, I will stop here, maybe comment later on some questions. But I think that my main argument is that EU, especially in the crisis situation, is much better if it tries to bring everybody together.
Yes, thank you very much. And this is actually not necessarily attention to the approaches that Jonathan and Sebastian are putting forward. The flexibility in implementation and the experimentalist governance are both ways to actually arrive at a common rule, but that is applied differently according to local needs. So I think we can then go a bit into empirical case studies to develop this tension and compatibility between diversity on the one hand and uniform commitment on the other hand in more detail. I would first invite Mr. Schierenbeck to react to these topics of differentiated integration, flexible implementation, and experimentalism, especially also with regard to your own portfolio and the quote I cited from your bio with regard to the engagement with stakeholders and private actors.
Okay, I'll come to this, but let me maybe first make also a comment where I support also what Ambassador Andrassy has said. I think in a way, convergent is always a preferred option, because we need to also understand that the more we differentiate, of course, the more we have complexity, legal uncertainty, and create a bit administrative burdens for the citizens and businesses that have to deal with the legislation that we put on the table as an offer, and that member states also then implement. So, of course, let's say having uniform rules is a preference, but of course we understand we are a union of diversity. We're united in diversity, and we need to take account of particularities. And in this way, differentiated integration is a way forward, where we see political differences. And so in this way, it's still a way of integrating further. But indeed, the long-term objective should be not to have a two-piecemeal system, so that citizens don't know what does apply now for me, because now I live in a different country, there are different rules. And I think this creates too much confusion with what has Brussels decided. And on that point, I'm going further, because I think we need to take care a little bit of how our regulatory system, etc., is being put in place. Because what is very important is that the expectations that citizens and businesses have for EU policy making are sort of living up to what is being decided. And of course, communication is a very important aspect. And one big problem I see there always is, of course, if things don't turn out very well, then Brussels has decided. And if things do very well, then it's quite often it's the local, regional, or national implementation. And very well. And I think we need to be aware that, in a way, good policy making, good regulation is a shared endeavor, and we need all stakeholders to be part of it. And this leads me to another thing. So, and I think this is not only where we need to take the member states much more on board, but also we need to reach out to the stakeholders on the ground. And we need to find ways much more to get ideas, to get a testing of the stakeholders who are impacted by the laws that we put on the place. And I think there on our side, we also have still work to be done. For instance, if you look at public consultations, sometimes we have too many questions, difficult to understand for citizens. And I think there is scope for improvement. But I think we also need, let's say, ahead of the decision making by the co-legislators and ahead of proposals being put forward by the Commission, we also need to explore a little bit more and involve citizens at an early stage. And you quoted a little bit from my little bio, the statement. I mean, I have quite a bit of experience of policy making, maybe at a lower level as a policymaker in a program area. And I find it's very important at an early stage to get into discussions with those that are affected by the policies, to test ideas, to get their reaction in order then to put something in place. And there we need to also use the new instruments that we have. I mean, for instance, in the better regulation sphere, we have published a communication this year, new guidelines, and a whole new toolbox that may allow us also to look at different and difficult issues. Take the examples of artificial intelligence. I think a lot of citizens are afraid of, being put aside by the whole digital transformation. And, we need to find ways to have a human-centered approach there. And that's why there's also a particular, I think it's toolbox number 67, that deals with artificial intelligence, so that we also test basically new legislation upon this. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I think we should also explore more different ways, whether this is regulatory sandboxes, whether this is the use of participatory budgets. So why not, if you want to empower citizens to come forward with ideas, why don't you always give them a little budgetary envelope to test ideas themselves, and then to see what's coming out of this and compare this with the traditional approaches that are being applied. So I think we need to much more comparative, innovative approaches and see what works in order also to improve the ways how we put in place different initiatives at EU level. thanks. That's for me for my first round.
Excellent. I think we can nearly start a debate because you stated both a clear preference for as much convergence as possible for different reasons, for reasons of equality, of fairness, but also reasons of complexity, transparency, accountability and responsibility in the end also of policies. So I would like to give back to Sebastian and Jonathan to tell us a bit more about the cases that they analyzed, the policy areas they looked into, and how they see this tension between allowing for this flexibility on the one hand, and also this bit open-ended experimentalist approach that Jonathan sees as particularly beneficial. So the tension between this on the one hand and the problems that can arise from too much complexity and divergence on the other hand. And maybe tell us also a little bit about under what conditions these modes of governance you see have been particularly successful. So Sebastian, would you like to start?
Yes, please. Thanks, Sandra. And also thanks for the other panelists for their contributions. I think indeed we have a number of important things to discuss. And maybe an underlying issue here is, to what extent do you want uniformity within the EU? And within the EU institutions, but also I think many scholars of EU politics and policymaking, there has been this underlying notion that we need more convergence, more uniformity. And this is, I guess, understandable from the background. So we're coming from a situation in which there are member states with their own system, and they're starting to cooperate with the view to bringing those systems together. And that is, of course, then your objective, to go towards more convergence and more uniformity. It is a different thing, however, whether that means that in the end, uniformity is the ideal to strive for. So in the integration phase, the build-up phase, this is, of course, the direction in which you're moving. But I guess at some point when policies mature, as they have in many areas of EU policymaking already, you encounter a new kind of dilemma, and that is, so how far do you need to go? Do you want to go in terms of uniformity? And then there is, on the one hand, a number of arguments for uniformity. So reduction of complexity, clarity for citizens and firms, removal of barriers, all those kinds of arguments that are well known. But there's also a counter set of arguments which have to do with the fact that situations are just not alike in all member states. It makes a huge difference whether you're managing a natural area, a protected natural reserve in Croatia or in Sweden or in Portugal or in the Netherlands. And so that's the kind of thing that you cannot really uniformly regulate at the EU level. And the same is true for almost any topic that you can think of, except for some exceptions. So if you compare the EU to a number of maybe more or less comparable systems which are more established, so federal states like the United States and Canada, you see that this is a perennial question, and there is never going to be pure uniformity at the level of the Union, because there are also a number of reasons why this at some point turns into its opposite and also has more negative than positive effects, because it means that you overregulate and that you cannot take into account differences between different parts of the Union anymore. So this is the dilemma that we're facing, and that works out differently in different areas. And so to begin with, the kind of issue you're regulating makes a huge difference. I use the example of the conservation and protection of natural areas. I mean, that is so forests and other kinds of areas. That is, I guess, an example where you would want quite some flexibility. But on the other hand, if it's, for instance, about the acceptance and authorization of medicines, that's probably an area where you would like a lot of uniformity, because that's something that is not really that different between member states. You want the medicines to be safe. And so it makes a difference what kind of issue you're looking at. At the same time, and now I'm moving to some examples from what we studied, there's also this development over time. So what we saw, for instance, in the case of the Energy Efficiency Directive, one of the cases that we studied, is that there is a succession of directives and other initiatives starting in the late 80s, early 90s, and going on until now. And you see a successive strengthening of the EU regulatory framework. So the specific directive that we studied, the 2012 Energy Efficiency Directive, offers quite a lot of flexibility to member states, but it was already one step further than the directive that preceded it. And the 2018 package that succeeded it already strengthened it at a number of points. So there you see this move in the integration phase towards greater convergence and greater uniformity. While at the same time, I think there's a number of reasons why it is not likely that there will be pure uniformity at the end, and it's probably not even desirable to have pure uniformity at the end, because situations differ between member states. For instance, if you look at the energy efficiency of buildings, it makes an enormous difference what kind of buildings there are in a member state. It makes a difference what kind of climate there is. It makes a difference what kind of legal and economic system you have. And so these kinds of differences are, well, as many reasons to also allow for a degree of flexibility. And I think that's what we sort of need to focus the debate on. It's not a general question, do we want pure uniformity or pure flexibility? It's rather, at what points do we need uniformity and convergence? At what points is it better to leave decisions to member states? And that will lead to some kind of balance, which will never be static, always in evolution. But nevertheless, it will be a balance. And I don't think there will be this continuing development towards uniformity in the end. I guess that's very important, because now we're at a point in the EU where in many areas the EU has moved or is moving from the integration phase towards the phase of established policymaking. There is a set of policy instruments, and it has been there for quite a while. So we face different questions now than we did when we were still setting up these policy arrangements. And I think that's an important debate to start, and a debate that requires also different kinds of assessments than perhaps we used in the past. I don't know if that answers your question, Sandra, but I thought that was maybe also relevant in response to what was said before.
No, definitely. I think perhaps the more examples we bring, the more easy it is to grasp. But perhaps we can follow up with Jonathan on the same line. So on the one hand, do you see the benefit and the possibility for experimentalist governance in particular types of policy areas, maybe more technocratic, more, you say, policy areas where there's a lot of uncertainty, but perhaps less in core state powers? So are there properties of the issue areas that allow for more flexibility than others? Also, this point of evolution over time. So Sebastian, you seem to say that there is over time a tendency that the policy becomes more convergent, yet unity should not be the target, because it should still allow for the necessary degree of flexibility. So do we also see that in experimentalist governance arrangements? And one other point that struck me, the last one actually you emphasized, or maybe your main point, Sebastian, if I understood you right, to say today we are no longer in this phase where we have to decide whether to integrate a policy area or not. We are a multi-level polity where the European Union transpires into all sorts of policy sectors, and then it makes not so much sense anymore to try to divide up. This is EU, this is Brussels, and this is national, because it is much more intermingled than that. It's much more multi-level. And going back to Mr. Schierenbeck, when you said, well, if we have too much complexity and diversity, citizens and also business doesn't know who to praise when it works well or who to blame when it doesn't work well. Well, is it really possible to say to make this distinction between this is Brussels and this is your national legislation, because everything is so interdependent? I don't know if this was a bit in the direction you meant, Sebastian. If you want to directly react before we pass on to Jonathan.
No, let's just go on with Jonathan and
Okay.
others. I think that's better.
Okay, so Jonathan?
Well, thanks, Sandra. I think the things I have to say speak to each of the questions that you have posed. So in our work package, my colleagues and I studied the relationship between uniform regulation, differentiated integration, and experimentalist governance in 3 policy domains. That's electricity, banking, and regulation of genetically modified organisms. Now, in each of these domains, the dilemma of how to accommodate national diversity in EU policymaking has arisen prominently. They're each characterized by high levels of strategic uncertainty associated with rapidly changing markets and technologies. Each of these domains belongs to the internal market, and their interdependence and the resulting demand for uniform rules is strong. So we have to acknowledge that. But each is likewise politically salient and controversial to varying degrees across member states. So while they have a technical dimension, I would not say that they're technocratic in the sense that citizens don't follow or care about them. So in this very brief intervention, I want to concentrate on our comparative findings on electricity and banking regulation. If people are interested, I can also say something in a subsequent discussion about the GMO case, which is both important and quite distinctive. So the most important empirical findings of our research are the following. First, obviously, EU electricity and banking regulation diverge on one key point. In electricity, EU-wide policies and rules apply equally to all member states. In banking, by contrast, supervision of Eurozone credit institutions has been integrated into a single authority under the aegis of the European Central Bank. This is nested, however, within EU-wide financial regulation, and other member states may participate in the single supervisory mechanism and banking union, but they're not obliged to do so. Croatia has just joined the closer cooperation process with the SSM as part of its preparations to join the euro. But beyond this crucial difference, I would say the trajectory of EU regulatory governance is similar across the 2 sectors. In both, integrated rules and methodologies for their application have become progressively more uniform and detailed, but they still always leave room for local adaptation and contextualization. In both cases, moreover, common policies, rules, and methods are not centrally designed and hierarchically imposed, let's say, by the EU institutions, as in conventional uniform regulation. Instead, they're developed collaboratively by what we can call polyarchic networks of EU and national officials. And in both domains, finally, these increasingly uniform policies, rules, and methods have actually been developed through experimentalist comparison of different national and regional approaches, and they're regularly updated and revised through joint review of implementation in different local contexts. So they're not at all static, but are regularly being revised. And what we think is that these cases show that the conjuncture of high interdependence as part of the single market with high uncertainty may actually result in the emergence of what we can call simplified experimentalist governance architectures, which combine synchronic uniformity with diachronic revisability. So in such architectures, the rules and procedures may be progressively specified and discretion for lower level actors narrowed at any given moment. That's the synchronic side. But both rules and procedures remain contestable in light of local application, while revisions over time based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience provide a crucial source of improvement and adaptability for the governance system as a whole. This is the diachronic dimension. And I think that we can say as well that governance architectures of this type may be expected to become increasingly prevalent in other sectors subject to rapid and unpredictable changes in markets and technology, where concerns to promote a level playing field and prevent regulatory arbitrage are similarly strong. We can think of telecommunications, we can think of competition, we can think also of chemicals regulation, and Sebastian mentioned drug authorization regulation, which is also a good example of this, where post-market pharmacovigilance is very important in adjusting the authorization and conditions of the use of drugs. So our comparative analysis of these cases suggests a couple of broader lessons for the relationship between uniform regulation, differentiated integration, and experimentalist governance in the EU. First, it supports the view that conditions of high interdependence coupled with high uncertainty may require rules and practices to be both uniform and revisable in order to be effective. But the analysis also supports the view that such uniform rules and practices can be accepted as legitimate by diverse EU member states, but under certain conditions. And those conditions are provided that the rules and practices are applied in contextually sensitive ways and regularly revised on the basis of a kind of deliberative review process in which national officials, and we could say also other stakeholders, participate. And so this further suggests a broader general conclusion that rather than uniformity and experimentalism being antithetic or opposed to one another, diachronic experimentalism may actually be a necessary condition for synchronic uniformity of regulation within a heterogeneous polity like the EU. And the second broad lesson is really, I want to come back to what I said earlier, is about the relationship to differentiated integration. So while differentiated integration may allow further integration to move ahead in the face of opposition from some member states, and indeed Ambassador Andrassy and Mr. Schierenbeck both emphasize that, and that's of course what we see in banking regulation, but it doesn't do anything to address the still substantial challenges of accommodating diversity among the countries that participate in a differentiated integration scheme. And for this, we need experimentalist practices and other forms of flexibility. And here again, to come back to the higher level of abstraction, I want to reiterate what I said earlier, that for this reason, experimentalist governance and differentiated integration may be complementary, but in an asymmetric way, insofar as differentiated integration still depends on experimentalism to accommodate diversity within, and as in the banking union, across separate groups of member states, but experimentalism does not necessarily require differentiated integration to move ahead. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So I will now give back the microphone, so to speak, to Ambassador Andrassy and Mr. Schierenbeck. And I would like to focus a bit the discussion on the institutional and organizational aspect of this notion of process-oriented, ongoing, interactive governance that is behind this label of experimentalism, right? You explained to us now very well, Jonathan, how it works. So it is iterative interaction between EU level and national level regulators and also the relevant stakeholders. And in your work, you highlight very much the role of regulatory agencies, which act as a hub of national regulators for the electricity markets. You highlight the role of the ACER for the banking supervision, the single supervisory mechanism, and the EBA. So my question would be, when we reflect further on the role of these modes of governance in promoting diversity, yet also allowing for further integration, where Mr. Schierenbeck and Ambassador Andrassy see the role of these decentralized secondary structures of the EU administrative space, if we so want, as a forum within which this form of cooperation can evolve, whereas the central decision-making political bodies of the EU, the Council, the Parliament, in particular, are more probably, well, less flexible for this kind of operative, process-oriented governance. So, yes, please. What would be your reaction, Ambassador Andrassy, first?
Thank you very much. And my first reaction would be just to compare two different layers, as you now said. I think that our processes of interinstitutional cooperation tend to be quite boxed into the rules of procedure, following the competencies of each institution, which is not necessarily always that everybody sees eye to eye, and then sometimes there is this interinstitutional battleground for more or less competence or for more or less influence. But I think that in the Council, what I said before about everybody trying to be at least most of the member states trying always to converge. It's not the same as uniformity. It's not, I mean, convergence is not the same as either. I saw on the chat even a question on cohesion. Yes, cohesion, and there is a policy behind it, but that does not necessarily mean more integration in a sense of federalization or things like that. Depends whom you ask. We have this nice now, maybe more informal or more flexible setup of a conference on the future of Europe. So yes, I mean, there are other mechanisms and instruments that try to bring together all different stakeholders to exchange on what kind of future there might be. But I would also say that a normal citizen, a typical regular guy on the street, perhaps would never go into a discussion on very complex notions, mechanisms, or even understand what the decision-making in Brussels is like. So in that sense, I would say that these more flexible frameworks of influence, some of them already existing, some of them maybe nascent, are an important part of discussing EU and where it's going and in which direction. But maybe the agencies or the comitology is very complex that would not necessarily also be understood in the typical public sphere, are the frameworks that also kind of always have a logic and are not, maybe not even necessarily more flexible. There are also more rules that apply. But I would say that the views of getting closer to have a kind of a global picture of the policies, on the regulatory forms that we have? Do we have more regulations or more directives? Do we take into account the sensitivities of our specific needs of member states? Yes, I would actually advocate that we do that. But we have to find a way how to still reach decisions and adopt that piece of legislation, regardless of whether it's a regulation or a directive, regardless of whether the member states would then feel that they have to abide or they were overvoted, outvoted, or that something is imposed or not, because typically, we do take this into account as member states, that yes, there are occasions that this happens and that you will not always have everything and all the flexibility that you perhaps need as a member state with very specific situation, I don't know, in energy or in health, or the very good example, I think, is how we managed the COVID crisis. Because we did, in the end, find a way where, in the beginning, some of the member states were yelling, no, we want to handle this at the national level, this is a national competence. Then, in some middle of the crisis, there was a kind of a very express need of more Europe. Now we are maybe in the third phase, where there is this balance in between what the coordination is at the EU level and what's happening on the ground in the member states and how this works. And there is an element of a more flexible, let's say, cooperation and coordination among the member states without very specific mechanism. I don't know whether it's an experimental, flexible integration, but sometimes it does look like that. Because we are exploring new situations, new ways of cooperating, but still with the understanding that the member states do work together, and with the institutions we arrive at the decisions at the EU level. So I don't know whether this is entirely an answer to the question of how we see it, but I think there is always a combination of different mechanisms, and we don't need to invent some. We have them on the ground every day.
Thank you very much. I would like to encourage everybody to put questions in the chat. If you like, you may also raise hands and then we can unmute you. Actually, the organizers will be able to unmute you if you prefer. But in the meantime, I think there are no open questions in the chat. Otherwise, please put them again if I overlooked something. In the meantime, I would hand over to Mr. Schierenbeck with the same question after having heard more about the empirical cases, the policy areas where our colleagues have studied these modes of flexible implementation and experimentalist governance, where you see that these modes of flexible policy making work particularly well and may become even more important in the future for European integration, and whether there are some policy areas where you would say no, in no way we should have this enhancement or this encouragement of flexibility. So policy areas where uniformity is particularly important, and coupled with that also the question about the institutional setup for flexible governance and the role of regulatory agencies, also for the participatory interaction that you promote in your bio with regard to the stakeholders. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me start first a little bit to respond also to the examples and what Sebastian and Jonathan has laid out. I think what I retain there very much and I strongly support is, I think the argument what I heard is that one need to distinguish also by the different policy areas. So I think when it comes to an area of where justice is concerned, where there's something, maybe consumer rights, where people expect that they should have the same rights where they are, wherever they are, whatever they do, I think then we need to be a bit more particular. What I also very much liked, I think the examples that Sebastian gave with energy efficiency was, I think, a very powerful one. And it made it also very clear that, okay, as much as Ambassador Andrassy and I have argued for maybe sort of a bit more uniform is the ideal. Of course, I fully agree with the argument. We have to see what works in practice. And when it comes to this, we need to take into consideration what are the situations in the different member states. And I think the example that Sebastian put forward was absolutely putting it right. And I think what we need to have there is a kind of a practicability test. I don't know, will it work in practice if we would have a uniform one? I mean, then there needs to be, and therefore also the exchange with stakeholders, with citizens is absolutely vital. I mean, I think that's very clear. I also like the point that Jonathan very much made, is that I think the revision and reviewing and changing and updating, it must be an absolute vital part of the process, how we proceed. And I think that we shouldn't forget. Now, in terms of the argument that Sebastian brought forward about that we are at a stage already where we have established policy making, I mean, there I would like to bring also forward his own argument to say that it, again, depends on the policy area. I think in some areas also at EU level, we have long history. I think there may not need to be a lot of change. The expectations don't vary, whereas in other areas, thinking of at the moment the COVID crisis on health, I mean, it depends on, you know, how much competence the member states have and the EU, how is it aligned, and in some areas, then the expectations that the citizen have that EU must do something, or Brussels need to do something where there's no competence. That is, of course, always then a problem, and that we need to communicate very clearly also, you know, where the power lies. Now, you brought up, Sandra, the issue also a little bit of how we can make better use of national bodies, decentralized agencies, and I think there should be much more use made of it. The problem is, of course, always not in every member state you have a regulatory body. You know, in some areas only some have. So we need to find, however, ways that we make use of them much more. I mean, let's think also of impact assessment, etc. I mean, the Green Deal, the implementation, you know, the huge discussion about this. And I think we need to build upon the consolidated experience that we have in the member states of different bodies, of different methodologies, of how we assess costs, of, you know, how we calculate, and also the experiences that member states have with their policies, which are at different stages. And I think that combined knowledge we need to use much more. That's why I'm also a strong advocate of you know, some soft tools like peer learning, you know, policy exchanges, because that can of course prepare the policy making in the long run. And I mean, Ambassador Andrassy also flagged out sort of a bit the complexity of the policy making. And I think we need to sort of be aware that the process of the decision making is also in such way, I mean, in the member states, we have different experiences. They come with their national view, of course. Then you have those who, the member states representatives that are in Brussels, that have a bit more an eye also for what are the voices from the other member states. And then, of course, you have the different institutions here. So it is a process of building upon the experience and trying to find a compromise. That is not always easy. And then also to explain to the citizens the compromises that have been found and perhaps the impacts that they have. I think that we need to be fully aware.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I would like to follow up with a maybe final round of questions, as long as there are no new questions coming in the chat. And these questions relate back to discussions we have had also yesterday, the distinction between multi-speed versus multi-destination differentiation on the one hand, the role of Brexit, secondly, and thirdly, external differentiated integration, that is the role of third countries, which are not full member states, with regard to these more subtle ways of flexible policy making that we are discussing in this last panel. So for all of you, the questions would be these flexible mechanisms of differentiated flexible implementation and experimentalist governance. I assume you would say they are more apt to manage multi-speed diversity rather than multi-destination diversity, where member states don't agree on the purpose of integration, but this is a question. And related to this Brexit, the role of the UK in your analysis, Sebastian and Jonathan, you have also covered the period where the UK was a member state. How did you observe its participation with these subtle ways of managing diversity? And why did, could they have been a buffer, a way to accommodate diversity and thereby reduce the demand for exit? And finally, with regard to associated third countries that participate in several of the policy areas that are studied, where do you see the possibilities to bind them into the shaping of legislation on the one hand for the experimentalist governance and for the differentiated or flexible implementation? How much difference is there between a full member state under a directive that gives a wide scope for the national discretion and associated countries under the EEA in Switzerland, but perhaps also the more advanced ENP partners, apart from, of course, the different mechanisms of supervision and enforceability? Do you think that your mechanisms travel also well for studying the management of diversity with associated non-member states? So, and we can start again with Sebastian.
Yes, well, if I listen to your questions and I try to sort of tease out an overarching theme, it's about the bigger political questions. Can you use flexible implementation and experimentalist governance, but that's Jonathan's area. Can you use them also to address these sort of bigger issues of where to go with the EU and to keep member states in? And I think I'm certainly not saying that flexible implementation is sort of a panacea for all. I mean, it's one of the things that you can use to accommodate diversity. But there is also a number of clear limitations to it. And one of the limitations is that I think it probably does not work when more symbolic issues are at stake. And so differentiated integration, opt-outs, derogations, they are very visible. The member state says, I'm not in. I don't want to be part of this, which also is a very visible signal towards its citizens. Now, of course, we know from, for instance, the work by Marta Migliorati on Denmark that this in practice can go together with a lot of cooperation on the ground, but still symbolically, politically, it's a clear signal, I don't want to be part of something. And of course, symbolism has its place in politics. It's important, and it's a way also to sort of signal what kind of ideal a government is striving for, at least what kind of final arrangement in terms of the EU. And in that sense, I think flexible implementation is much less suited for that kind of purpose, because it's much more, one could say, technical, detailed. It's probably not very visible to people. So in a sort of in a direct way, it is not going to help governments to persuade people that they should stay in or be part of the EU. I don't think the UK people would have voted differently if they had been given a bit more flexibility in certain directives or regulations. I mean, that's not the way that kind of political debate works. And so I think you have to be careful there. It has its purposes, it has its value, but not so much in settling these fundamental debates about the fidelity or what the EU should be doing. And of course, that is also what, I mean, when we're talking about implementation, at least there is agreement on what we're striving for in broader terms. And then there's flexibility in terms of how you can achieve that and what you can do to achieve that goal. But when there's real fundamental, maybe even ideological disagreement about what the goal should be, then flexible implementation is maybe too subtle, to use your term, to address it. And so I think that's where we also run into the limitation of this specific approach. And that's, well, not an answer to each of your questions specific, but I think it is relevant to each of the questions you raised. And well, maybe also shows that we need other ways to deal with those kinds of processes.
Thanks. Jonathan, how do you see the questions?
Thanks very much. I'll try to touch briefly on each of your questions. The third one is the one I find the most interesting. Multi-speed versus multi-destination. I mean, you know, my own view is that, and I think this is what's borne out by the research that Frank Schimmelfennig and others have done, is that most differentiated integration in the EU is temporary. It is multi-speed in character. And I don't think experimentalism plays much of a role there, except in terms of perhaps assessing when member states have met the conditions in question. Where the interface is more important is, as I suggested, in how to manage continuing diversity within groups of who are participating in a differentiated integration scheme, and also to bridge the boundaries or relations with those who have not, as we see in the banking union. As regards Brexit, I mean, here one can say, okay, on the one hand, if we look at electricity, you know, the UK participated very actively in the experimentalist processes of building the governance framework for the integrated electricity market. That there was no problem there. In the case of banking, by contrast, we see also that a crucial reason why banking union went ahead in the way it did, the SSM, is because the UK did not want to join, and it was necessary to work out a way to prevent the UK from blocking these arrangements. And but the UK's interests were accommodated, for example, through a double voting system for banking union ins and outs in financial rulemaking in the European Banking Authority. Underlyingly, we can say that the reasons for Brexit were not primarily to do with policy issues. They were political and ideological. And for that reason, experimentalist governance couldn't help too much, but all the differentiated integration and opt-outs that the UK was given didn't help either. And finally, on external differentiation, as I say, I think this is the really interesting area. And here I have some differences perhaps with other people in the IndiviU project, in the sense that I think external differentiated integration is defined in a relatively narrow way in the project as EU law applying to, or EU rules applying legally to non-member states under certain conditions. But as you yourself, Sandra, have shown, there's a large world of the projection of EU rules beyond its boundaries, which doesn't necessarily follow formal external differentiated integration, and that which you've called external governance, and if the third countries participate, extended governance. And there, I do think that experimentalist arrangements play an important role in terms of contextualizing EU rules to circumstances elsewhere, to having mechanisms for evaluating the so-called adequacy or equivalence of the rules in other countries in specific sectors to meet the requirements of the EU for importing various kinds of products and services into the European market. I think it's worth mentioning, however, I think of these regulatory equivalents is the most promising, but we can also see a limitation, and that is very much a political limitation. We see it in terms of the arrangements for assessing and recognizing as equivalent financial regulation in countries like Switzerland or indeed the UK, where particularly in the Swiss case, the designations of equivalence have been used as, or the withdrawal of such designations have been used as a mechanism to try to put political pressure on Switzerland to sign a broader framework agreement with the EU. In the case of the UK, I mean, it's easy to understand why the kind of absence of trust in the kind of detailed sharing of information and cooperation that would be needed to make regulatory equivalence work is, at least for now and for the medium-term future, absent in the case of the UK. And there's also the argument, which I think makes sense, that equivalence decisions have to be proportionate to the risks involved in the relationship with the third country. So if you are highly dependent on financial transactions with an offshore financial center like the City of London, you may need to apply stricter criteria for equivalence than you would with Canada or Australia or another financial center which poses fewer systemic risks to the EU system. So with these regulatory equivalence determinations, I do see a political challenge to the operation of experimentalist mechanisms. Sorry for going on a bit.
Yeah, we share an interest in this external dimension, but all the panels have concluded admirably on time, and I'm afraid I will have chaired the only one which goes a little bit over time, but we have, I think, the flexibility to spend a few minutes more because we would really like to hear the final observation by Ambassador Andrassy and Mr. Schierenbeck. Please, Ambassador Andrassy.
Thank you very much, and I will try to be very, very quick. I would just very quickly comment on the internal and then on the external dimension, as you asked us. And there is one thing that I think they have in common. I would say that the differentiation is always also about respecting the differences, and that is okay. But when we talk about internal market or economy, there will always be, I think, within the EU, this golden standard that everybody would want to reach, that they would want to ensure for the citizens more prosperity, and that there will be more agreement on how to come to a converged decision. The more you go into the sphere of values, perhaps, or differentiation based on societal elements or history or culture, there we are approaching the areas where perhaps it's always more requests to respect the differences in a way that is also seen in the decisions and the acts, even the legislation that member states would want to see and that they would like that to be incorporated or taken into account in a specific way. But I would say that element is also could be also applied to what we are doing to the external segment. We have the immediate neighborhood, Western Balkans, they're candidates for membership. They don't actually have much of a choice. They will sooner or later, if they want to go in, have to apply what the EU at the time is with the full range of the acquis. The Eastern Partnership, perhaps Southern Partnership, that ring of neighborhoods, yes, we are always discussing this integration, more or less internal market, so you have participating in the internal market. And then you mentioned Switzerland, EEA, and perhaps UK even later on, with the participation in the economic cooperation. But then again, when you come